Lots to get into, and I want to get into it right away. But quickly, we're going to have Jeff Brom on the show a little bit later as he gets his Purdue Boilermakers ready for the Big Ten Championship game. So that's exciting. But I want to get into these playoff rankings that came out this week and give you my reaction, because there's three things I think distinctly that we need to think about and really wrap our minds around when it comes to the playoff rankings as they're given to us currently. So here's what the committee gave to us. Georgia is number 1, Michigan's number 2, TCU is number 3, and USC is number 4. I didn't have a great deal to argue with there. I guess you could argue Michigan at number 1, but listen, Georgia is 30-1 in their last 31 games. That's the best record in college football. They're the defending national champion, so I don't have a problem with them being number 1 at all. Now, what we thought was going to be interesting is what was happening at 5 and 6, and Ohio State's going to edge out Alabama, and so Ohio State is 5 and Alabama is 6. Now, if you really wanted to get into the nitty-gritty, two teams I saw play each other. They have the exact same record. One beat the other, and yet the committee is telling me that the team that lost that game is 6 and the other team is 7. Tennessee should probably be 6, but listen, whatever. I mean, it's Bama, and they're going to get the brand bias pretty much in every single case as long as Nick Saban is still there. Let's get into the 3 points that I want to get into. So those top 3 teams right now in those playoff rankings are all undefeated: Georgia, Michigan, and TCU. And I think that all of those teams should remain in the playoff and in playoff position, even if they were to lose this week in conference championship game weekend. When you look at their resumes, there's really no way that they could lose an argument against an Ohio State or specifically an Alabama. When you start going through it, it's like, well, Georgia's got great wins, and they've obviously got the pedigree, and they're 12-0 through an SEC regular season. So they're going to go regardless. I think that we all know that. Then you get to Michigan, and it's like, well, Michigan's going to win an argument over Ohio State because we just saw that game play out. Plus, Michigan's got 12 wins. Bama's only got 10. Now Michigan has a win over Ohio State in the shoe. The best win Bama has is Texas. So Michigan would win an argument in that regard, which brings us to TCU. I think TCU actually wins an argument even if they lose over both of these other teams. Because remember, in the event they lose, it's to Kansas State this week in the Big 12 Championship game. Kansas State would then be firmly in the top 10. Which means that TCU also has a win over a top 10 team because they beat Kansas State earlier in the season. They also have a win over Texas, which is Bama's best win. So you start to play this out. They've got the 12 wins. Ohio State only has 11 wins. You start to play it out, and you quickly start to realize those 3 teams should be in regardless of outcome this weekend. So that lends us to, well, how does Bama get in then? What's the path for Bama? If there's not 2 spots that are potentially coming available, even if everybody loses, then how does Bama actually sneak into the playoff? They don't. I think Bama is out, and I think that that's very clear. They're not going over Georgia. That's pretty clear. They're not going over Michigan. That's pretty clear. And if you want to create the argument against TCU, I just outlined a little bit of it right there. TCU would have a win over Kansas State under their belt. That's a better win, any win, than Alabama has. By the way, TCU's strength of record and strength of schedule is pretty darn good when you actually look at the resume. And then you start to get to the point where you look at the best win Alabama has, and that's Texas on the road in Austin. Guess who also has a win against Texas on the road in Austin? TCU. And TCU did it in a more dominant fashion than Bama did it, when Bama was actually outplayed and kind of got lucky late in order to win that game. So TCU is going to win that argument, which means Bama's out. I don't think there's any path whatsoever that Alabama can make the college football playoff, which brings us to USC and Ohio State. So who would win in an argument? Let's just say Utah were to win the Pac-12 championship, and now we're going to have an argument between USC and Ohio State. Well, see, in that sense, I think Ohio State might actually win the argument. One, because they've got a top 10 win that happened on the road at Penn State. The best team that USC would have played all year would be Utah. They would have lost to that Utah team now twice. That's pretty debilitating when you actually look at it. So I think Ohio State would actually go to the playoff if USC were to lose, which means who's Georgia rooting for? If you're Georgia on the eve of your SEC championship game and you start looking at this and you're like, well, who would we rather play? Is it USC or is it Ohio State? That becomes a fascinating question. In one regard, you've got Caleb Williams, who's probably about to win the Heisman Trophy and should, because he's playing as well as anybody I've seen in a long time. He's playing with a supreme confidence, bordering on arrogance out there. He just knows he's going to be successful. This is a team that creates takeaways. They seem to be on a roll. Meanwhile, Ohio State, the last time we saw them, they were getting, 28 put on them in the second half of that game? Like, they didn't look that great. So who would Georgia rather face? Well, isn't it actually pretty clearly USC? Let's not fall victim of recency bias of seeing that Ohio State, who won every game prior to Michigan by double digits, is actually a roster that would compete with Georgia to a much better degree than the roster that USC has. USC might be playing up right now because of their quarterback, but if you actually look at what the lines would be in those semifinal games, Georgia would be favored by somewhere around 13.5 over USC and only 5 over Ohio State. So Georgia and Georgia fans, if you're watching that game on Friday night, and I know you will be on Fox, Brock, you've got the call, Jason Benetti as well with Allison Williams, I think you're rooting for the Trojans because I think you would rather see USC. Even though you have to see Caleb Williams, that's a roster that you clearly have an advantage over rather than the Ohio State Buckeyes. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoy that clip, make sure you click subscribe somewhere down here. From game highlights to exclusive interviews and rankings, we've got everything you need as a college football fan right here, College Football on Fox.